So, welcome to Lyndsie Bourgon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Lyndsie, start off by telling us a bit about yourself, please.
Sure. So I am a writer. I'm an oral historian, and I am a 2018 National Geographic Explorer. I live in British Columbia in Canada. I live in the interior of the province, so it's quite forested around here. And I moved here actually to work in oral history. I grew up on the prairies in Canada, and I've lived kind of all over, but this is where we've ended up.
Oh, very nice. And you've written this great book called Tree Thieves, which I absolutely adored. It touches on so many complex issues and how everything's connected. So, what inspired you to write this book and carry out this huge amount of research?
Well, so in 2012, there was an old growth cedar that was growing on Vancouver Island along the west coast of Canada. And I read a news story about how the cedar had been poached in the middle of the night. And at the time, I thought, well, first of all, I was surprised because, as I said, I grew up in a prairie area. So I didn't grow up around big trees, and I didn't grow up around logging economy at all. Or forestry at all. So I was surprised that this happened. I was surprised that it could happen. And I had a lot of questions about, where it goes, what type of, investigation takes place, who the folks are that do the poaching. And I started digging into it and very quickly kind of realized that there was this I didn't realize I'd done so much reading that I found that there was this really deep history to poaching, and that timber poaching actually it is quite common, and that had all these underlying roots to it, and that the motivations were obviously financial, but that there were a lot of more complicating factors to it. And once I knew that it was going to be kind of a bigger story like that, that's when I started to think, okay, well, this could be a book, because there's a lot going into not just the crime, but the motivations for the crime and the foundations of the entire region that this crime is taking place in.
Fascinating. And timber poaching is nothing new, is it? I mean, you start
Mm-mm.
off with a really good overview of history, starting in the UK with Robin Hood. Tell
Mm-hmm.
us about your thoughts on why Robin Hood did what he did and why we still make films about him. What was the essence of his success as a poacher?
Yeah, and what I think is really interesting is that there is a kind of no longer, well, unfortunately he's no longer with us, but there's a poaching expert named Rory Young, and he traveled the world, and he really worked in kind of anti-poaching measures on all sorts of levels. And in the book that he wrote about poaching, he said that the issue with Robin Hood, or the challenge with Robin Hood, and why the sheriff of Nottingham could never catch him, was because he had the community on his side. And that is something that continues right through until today. And that's because poaching is a folk crime. It's a response to a loss of commons and a loss of rights to use the forest in a number of
Yes.
ways. And poaching, of course, we think of it as taking the king's deer, for instance, right? But there are lots of records, historical records, that talk about the taking of sticks and wood and logs and woodland itself from the forest, because that was a sort of bedrock of everyday life.
It
And
was, wasn't it? I mean,
mm-hmm.
it's the rights of two of my favourite words, estover and pannage, in the UK, whereby local people could just take what they needed in a responsible way to fuel
Exactly.
their fires, etc.,
And
and let their
if you
pigs
look at
graze.
some of the historical documentation around it, and some of the kind of court logs, or verderers court logs, right? Because there were often special forest courts for forest crimes. A lot of people were taking wood for cooking purposes, for campfires, for building, but not building that we would think of today, like extensive, large scale building, but building for personal use. I think that there's mention in some of the records of people taking wood to brew beer with. And so this was small scale, but also when access to that wood was taken away, it had this really sort of large negative effect on community, because it wasn't it wasn't the way that we might think of conservation now, that stops logging, that is clear cut and unsustainable. You know, it was really a shutting down of a process that just allowed life to unfold. And there are stories that come out of that time that continue now, that people talk about now. And there are folks that I interviewed, poachers that I interviewed, who said to me that they felt that they were following in Robin Hood's footsteps. And I think, Robin Hood is the mythical face on this, but really they're thinking of the people that I was reading about who were charged with taking wood from forests.
Yes, so. And actually, moving a bit forward in time and back to the USA, tell us about the early protection of the redwood forest. When was that, and how did that start? Who initiated that?
Yeah, so in the early 20th century, there were a group of businessmen, essentially, and leaders, folks that had their fingers kind of in politics and business. And they took a road trip up from the southern part of California up into the north, into the redwoods. And by that point, logging had really kind of taken off in that area. It was actually slow to start, but as logging kind of ticked its way east to west across the United States, eventually the redwoods were the edge of that logging, and quite an impressive one. So much kind of amazing and at the time considered endless, boundless timber was coming from that region then. And so a group of three men, Miriam, Osborne, and Grant, they took a road trip up to kind of see about the business happenings in Northern California. And when they saw logging, they were aghast. They felt shocked by it, and they began a organization that would become the Save the Redwoods League, which is a very iconic conservation organization in the Pacific Northwest, particularly Northern California. And they did that, this was kind of pre-World War I. They did that in a way that they knew how at the time, which was to solicit donations from their very wealthy peers, to buy up land that was owned and being logged by private logging companies, and to set it aside for conservation. And so what ended up happening was there were these kind of like patchwork areas that had been bought by the Save the Redwoods League that were set aside and couldn't be logged anymore. So they might have been at the top of watersheds or groves here and there. But logging continued all around it. And I mean, as your listenership knows, it definitely kind of waned and came back over time with the markets itself. But the early conservation really began in those days with the kind of emotional reaction from three men who were not from the area, but who had really kind of deep, powerful connections.
And it's very easy to have an emotional reaction of awe, and wonder at the size and majesty of these trees. And the book describes the special ecosystem that they provide. And as I think that's probably widely understood by the readership. And you also go on to describe in 1964 that there was a flood as well.
Yeah, and so that is because, well, not because, but that was the confluence of a number of events. So one of the events is that post Second World War, there was a real national push to build more homes, and this was seen as part of the recovery from the American war effort, what have you. And logging across the country and the timber industry and mills were just, they were booming. There were a lot of jobs and there was a lot of demand for the product that they were spitting out. And so at the same time, a lot of technology had been developed actually for the war that could then be applied to other industries coming out of it. And so logging was easier. And it became really easy to just kind of log way more than it had ever been logged before.
Yeah.
Really quickly, and send it to mills and have that product kind of start pumping out, and people really seeing the bottom line increase. And
Yeah.
and so there were these kind of confluence of events. And as many, I presume, but as a lot of your listenership might know, deforestation at that speed can really destabilize the forest floor. It really has an impact on the ecosystem that the trees are rooted in. And so in the hills in Northern California, a lot of clear cut essentially had taken place. There was a lot of kind of arid land. And when a huge rainfall came, it was the earth was not able to kind of absorb this water, and there were no trees there that could utilize it and could kind of prevent the stability of the floor from falling out from underneath it. And a landslide took out all the towns at the bottom of these valleys. And so that set about its own wave of environmental conservation efforts in the north, in Northern California, because people saw that, including now the Sierra Club and then the later iterations of the Save the Redwoods League. They saw this and they thought, well, here's an example of what happens if we don't stop logging, if we don't stop the clear cut. And efforts really jumped from there, and they lasted for 20 to 30 years. There was a serious push in those regions to remove logging land from logging use, and to either conserve it as a park or as a reserve.
At what point did or this may not be a straightforward answer. Sorry, no, this may not be a straightforward question to answer, but at what point did it become a reserve or a park?
Yeah, so the first, so as I said, there was this kind of patchwork network at the beginning, right? And then the first iteration of Redwoods National Park was founded in 1968. And what that did was it connected some of that patchwork together, and some of the land was being managed by the Forest Service, which in the United States, it's a federal government agency. It's not a park though, so those are lands that are owned by the government, but they're logged. Some of them might be conserved, but really they have multi-use. They might, you can go on a hike on national forest land. But a lot of that national forest land was kind of essentially decommissioned and handed over to the National Park Service, which meant that it couldn't be touched anymore, that this was full conservation land. And so that was kind of the first iteration of that. And then a decade later, that land expanded. And so the park expanded, and it also took into account some of the state parks that were surrounding that area.
And so this must have had an enormous impact on people's lives. So when this all happened, what was the typical demographic of the towns in the area? And how did it affect people's identity?
So what we know now, and the context in which I wrote about it and spoke about it, is really from late 1960s on. But we know that these towns, they had often been founded due to their location in the forest or at the edge of the forest near mills, or mills would be built within the town. And then often as dairy towns as well. In Northern California, there's the redwood curtain, as they call it. So just deep redwood forests, but then also these very lush valleys that were really perfect for dairy cattle. And so these were the types of towns that young families were moving to because work was there. They may have settled in the early 20th century and not left for quite a long time. I interviewed some families who had really deep roots in logging itself, and so they often moved to Northern California from other regions where they were involved. Their fathers essentially were involved in logging. And in the small towns that I visit, there's a town called Orick, there's a town called Scotia, and then as you go further north, there's all these small towns, Forks, etc. Their tax base came from the mills. It came from logging, and it came from the money that people earned doing that and pumping it back into the town. And so when the park was first proposed, there was a fair bit of feedback from town people saying, what is this going to mean for our communities if we can't log around here? There, at the very beginning in 1968, there was actually a little bit more of a balanced approach to this because the flood was so recent, and there was an understanding that, listen, maybe clear-cut logging isn't sustainable and isn't good for us. But the argument on the other way is that they had heard from many people in charge that tourism would bring so many people to the region that you would no longer need logging, and they were very suspicious of that claim.
Yes, and it turned out rightly so, because if we flood a sensitive area with people, it's going to affect the ecosystem, it's going to cause all sorts of imbalances. And so I read in your book that this really was intergenerational sense of identity, as well as a way of making a living, a sense of pride, strong communities. Really, that was taken away, and there was no direct government funding for those individuals.
There was, in 1968, there was not. When the park expanded in 1978, there actually was some government funds that were handed down, but they were provided either through the companies that were seeing work reductions or through the county itself. And a lot of people just never saw the benefit of that fund. Just to go back to what you were saying about intergenerational, I mean, there's a quote in the book, and there's a quote in some sources of a teacher saying, I'm not from here, but when I arrived, I noticed that what happens is that a father goes into the woods and soon after his son follows. And that is borne out by the stories that I heard during my interviews there. I mean, this is an inherited position often. I think it can feel quite quaint to say that it's, it's not a job, it's a lifestyle or what have you. But really, for a lot of folks, that is true. I remember I would ask people, like, do you remember when you first learned how to use a chainsaw? And they'd say, no, I was just always around them. Like, I don't actually know. I think one of the poachers who I spoke to, he said it was just through osmosis. Like, I didn't actually learn. And I don't think that they're exaggerating. I think that really is, it reminds me in a lot of, like, that reminded me in a lot of ways of the ranching and the farming communities that I grew up in. It is a job and an important one. And people do it because it's part of who their family is and, like, part of where they belong. And that can lead to some really difficult conversations when things are brought up as kind of black or white.
Well, that's what seemed to happen as I went on and read the book, is that it became more polarized. You said in the sort of late 60s there was some sensitivity, but then as the environmental movement, and I mean, don't get me wrong, like this podcast, and nobody here is saying that the redwoods are not hugely valuable for a multitude of different
This is
reasons. That's
exactly
not the
it.
point we're
Yeah.
making at all here. But there are always knock-on effects of any big change of land use.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, it seemed to me that tensions really, really rose to
Yeah.
the extent that there was, I saw some bumper stickers that you alluded to, and one of them was, "Are you an environmentalist or do you work for a living?" I got the impression that people were getting really quite angry, and there was a
Oh, yes.
convoy. Tell me about the convoy and the peanut.
Sure. So I think first it can help to kind of describe that around this time, there's not strict borders on the time, but we were really entering into something called the timber wars in the region. And so around 1978, when the park was being expanded and kind of all brought in together, all those smaller parks brought into one management system. The members of the town people of a town called Orick, which is really right on the southern edge of Redwood National Park. It's what they call a gateway town. So when you drive through, after you drive north through Orick, the minute you leave, you are in the park. So this is the park and the town are so inextricable. And a lot of folks really opposed the expanding of the park boundaries there for a number of reasons, including more loss of logging jobs, as well as kind of like an expansion of boundaries that didn't really take into account what the townspeople kind of saw as necessary, and a lack of consultation of a community that lives right in the town and so has a really kind of big stake in it. And so in a response to that, quite a few people got together and they decided that they were going to do a convoy and drive from Orick, which is right at the western edge.
Can I just
of,
interject you there? So you've got a
yeah.
really helpful map. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
Listeners, I hope you read the book, because this is just slightly off topic, but the way you've set out the book is super helpful for my sort of brain. You've got
Oh,
a
good. I'm
map
glad.
and you've got a list of characters. And then you've got a really helpful notes section at the back. But
Oh,
sorry, they
thank
went
you.
on this convoy. I've got the song in my head, convoy.
Yes.
And so they're on there because they're angry, aren't they? They don't feel like they're
Yes,
being heard.
they don't. And so they've decided that what they're going to do is they're going to make a statement. And what they did, so logging trucks, especially in North America, are just massive. I would never they're much, much, much bigger than a lorry. They are these really, really big shipping. They're almost like a ship,
Wow.
going down the road. And so a number of folks owned businesses where they own these trucks, and so they could pack them up and drive. They own the truck, they can do what they want. And they got together and they did fundraising to send out essentially quite a few men from the community and eventually from surrounding communities to drive to Washington, D.C. on the other side of the country. And they decided that they were going to take a gift of sorts to President Jimmy Carter, who was the president at the time. And he was known for having grown up and owned a peanut farm in the South. And so they selected a piece of redwood trunk and carved it into the shape of a peanut and put it on the back of the bed of a logging truck, so it was open to all, and drove it across the country and made pit stops in cities along the way, kind of arguing against the Redwood National Park expansion, trying to kind of get their public relations message out there. And when they arrived in Washington, they drove it right to the steps of the Capitol, parked their trucks. Definitely not, you can imagine driving a big truck to London or something.
Wow.
and parking it there. It's just not feasible.
Actually,
No,
not in
you
London.
actually couldn't. I don't think you could make it down the road with how wide these trucks are. But the president did not take a meeting with them. He sent out some of his representatives who declined the peanut and sent them back on their way. So there, as you can imagine, was quite a bit of anger at that. and they drove all the way home with this peanut. The peanut is now kind of on display in Orick outside of a business called the Shoreline Deli and Market, which is one of the kind of town hubs in a way. It's the only petrol station, only gas station, and it has picnic tables and food and stuff. So you can see the peanut there if you ever drive through.
And you went there. So
Yeah.
aside from, I mean, at that time, we just talked about with the peanut convoy, there was a growing environmental awareness. So there were completely separate groups of people.
Yeah.
In a way, the argument was becoming more polarized.
Oh man,
And it
and
was a
all
very
through
dark time.
it was, and all through the Pacific Northwest. Like in the book, I certainly focus a lot on Northern California because people very kindly spoke to me there. But the timber wars stretched all the way up into Canada, into British Columbia, and really the root of that was that a bird called the northern spotted owl was endangered. The northern spotted owl lives only in old growth. It relies on old growth kind of biodiversity, and old growth ecosystems. And as logging continued throughout the Forest Service land, a lot of activists really lobbied to get the northern spotted owl listed as an endangered species. And when that happened, when they were successful in that, it meant that anytime a logger or a logging company saw a northern spotted owl in the land that they were logging, they had to stop all operations and go through an environmental assessment review. And it really took a lot of timberlands off of the market, essentially. And the northern spotted owl itself became, a symbol of deep divides. So, you were talking about the bumper stickers, and there were bumper stickers about, like save a logger, eat an owl. Really kind of quite, I mean, it's funny, but quite harsh statements. And that really sparked, a particularly angry time in the Pacific Northwest, because you had now a symbol that everyone could unite either for or against. And this was a time then that was followed up by what you might like iconic images of tree huggers, people living in trees, like people setting up platforms in the highest branches of these trees. And the idea being that when they were up there, if a logging company came by, they couldn't take down that tree because there were human beings in it. They could hurt them. There were tactics used on both ends. There were literal brawls in the forest. There were very dangerous threats. One of the former loggers, or one of the poachers whose father is a former logger, told me that his dad said that he would leave his hotheads at home during that time because he didn't want anything horrible to happen on his watch if there were essentially protesters out in the woods. And the whole region was just taken over by anger in this way.
How terrible. And I guess in an atmosphere of anger and fear and distrust, it's very difficult to have new creative ideas about how to resolve the problem. Just generally, no
that was
matter what
almost
that
beyond
situation.
sorry for interrupting. That was almost beyond the point at some point. Do you know if that makes sense? I mean, I don't think eventually it wasn't even about a solution. It became about sides.
Yes, black and white.
And that made things really difficult.
Yeah.
And that remains today a very, I think, in the UK, this is a problem. In North America, it's a huge problem. There are a lot of, this is but one example of kind of a much larger issue of polarization that has only recently just become really, can feel quite overwhelming. And there were a lot of parallels in that as I was writing, that became kind of indicative of, this happened has happened in a region, and now it can be applied to so much more.
other industries, I was
Oh yeah.
reminded of the closure of the coal mines in the
Yep.
1980s in the UK and how that
Yep.
affected entire communities. Again,
Yep.
I'm not arguing the reasons why or they're closed or not closed. It's not the point we're making here. It's about the effect on people. And one of the things I
Exactly.
absolutely love about your work was the humanity behind it, the fact that you were privileged in a way, if I may use that word, to spend time in this hub in Oric and
I
get to
was
know the
very
local
privileged.
folks
Yeah.
in a way that was generous and open and non-judgmental, and how great they were for you. I mean, you don't have
Yeah.
to name names here, but do you want to talk
Mm,
about some of the stories of people's lives? You're free to
sure.
name
So
names if you wish to, it's up to you.
yeah, I mean, the book itself follows two timber poaching cases, and then a kind of broader community around those two cases, because those two cases uh, both are based in Oric. The poachers are from Oric, and they are part of a community in Oric because Oric is so small. And I had known through research that burl poaching, or burr poaching, I think in the UK they call
Should
burls
we talk
burrs.
about that for a little bit? Because
Mm-hmm.
listeners might not quite understand. Not everybody who listens is a tree expert. So
Okay.
let's go
Okay.
back to basics and then we'll come on to the people again. What
Sure.
is burl? What are they?
Sure. So poaching happens and looks kind of in all sorts of ways. I mean, it goes from people lopping off the top of trees, to taking branches, to taking whole trees. That's very common in other regions of the Pacific Northwest. And in redwoods in particular, the poaching is really around burl, which I think in the UK they call burr. And burl is often these large lumps that grow off the side of trees, some usually at the base, sometimes further up if they're kind of an anomaly. They look like big bubbles off the side of the trunk. They're covered in bark themselves. And the reason why they are poached, first of all, is that they're easy to lop right off. A lot of them, especially in Redwoods National Park, are massive. So one of the poaching cases that I follow in the book was a burl poaching case, but that burl was 8 feet tall, and had to be kind of carved out of the tree over a number of trips. And there's a strong market for it. It's very unique looking wood. Many people use it to make tables out of, to spin bowls out of. So it has this really unique kind of wavy pattern on the inside. And that's where the market for that comes from. It used to be very common in the 80s and 90s that burl would be taken from redwoods and sent to Europe and put into the consoles of cars. So if you ever saw that kind of wood interior, particularly of a kind of high-end or expensive vehicle, that was coming from burl.
Wow.
So it had this very kind of upscale market. And it has the benefit of being also a bit easier to poach than redwoods, which are just the tallest trees in the world, and very unwieldy. And it would be very, very difficult to log a redwood and get away with it. But taking a burl can happen over the span of 2 nights. So the risk is a bit lower there.
And leaving a massive gaping wound for the tree,
It
potentially for
is. Yep.
infection. But whilst we're talking about types of poaching, there are photographs in the book which are hard to look at, where planks are taken off the sides of large trees, where
Yeah.
just a bit out the middle is taken out of a tree. And I think in some of the cases, the tree is left deliberately unstable so that it
Yes.
has to be felled. And then it's
Exactly.
planked up in the night. So
Yes.
there are many different forms. Before we go on to what happens about that poach wood, let's go back to these people then
Yeah.
that you
Thank
met
you.
in Oric, and describe to me about their lives, the difficulties they had, the traditions that they came from.
Sure. So I think I said earlier, but Oric is a gateway town. And it, at its prime, it had a population of just over 2,000 people. But following the kind of 1980s, 1990s decline in logging, you know, they now have fewer than 200 people that live there now. And so I knew that I was going to visit Orick because I had read about timber poaching or burl poaching from that region. And, you know, when I showed up, I started talking to people just at the Shoreline Deli, that hub that I mentioned, and some of the burl shops. And everyone was really kind and very open in talking to me about what was going on with their town. People really wanted to talk about what had happened to their town because you know, this was a pretty steep decline. And there was really strong memories around what the town used to be like, and what kind of brought everyone together and why it had disappeared. And once I started discussing the challenges of the town and what made the town good as well as difficult at times, you know, I started asking about a couple folks. So Danny Garcia was one, and Derek Hughes. These were the two cases. And really, I think the fact that I had asked was enough. You know, I've said a number of times that I don't think anyone had ever reached out to ask either of them about their cases and why they had poached. And so, yeah, I entered into kind of a relationship of some kind with them, where we would talk. COVID hit, so I wasn't able to be there again, but, you know, where we spoke fairly regularly about their cases and their lives. And, you know, we really took the time to dig into what growing up was like, what their families were like. It wasn't always about the fact that, why did you do this?
No, not at all. I think you deal with that very sensitively, and
thank you.
the book talks about difficulties in their family backgrounds and sadnesses which happened, and the fact that, and also, you know, just that loss of identity and who they are. I mean, I'm not advocating crime at all,
No,
but I absolutely love the way that you explored the humanity. So often you talked about what's happened in their lives, and there are often links with drug use.
Yes. So this actually was presented to me first when I was doing kind of my introductory interviews on this topic, like long before I was writing the book. And, you know, I would be calling rangers or local experts and asking why this is happening. And almost every interview was very consistent in saying that, you know, methamphetamines, meth use is a huge part of this. The Pacific Northwest has a pretty strong tradition of meth being a problem. You know, the history of how that drug was introduced to the region and why it took off is itself very interesting. I mean, it is an amphetamine. Loggers often have to work very long hours, so there was a real desire for, and even the history of meth is actually really interesting. I mean, it was developed as a work drug, you know, and so a lot of these towns have really had serious challenges with not only economic depression, but what follows, which is often reliance on substances and turning to drug misuse as a response to kind of really difficult circumstances. And you know, definitely in Orick, again, a lot of people were talking to me and saying, like, I mean, the town has a meth problem, and people steal to get money and then also to pay for drugs.
Isn't this a really common thread? I mean, I'm no social anthropologist, but you see this throughout the globe, where communities' way of life has been taken from them, albeit for whatever reason. And now, in fact, it could be climate change.
Yes.
But aside from climate change, which is a huge subject for other podcasts, you look at indigenous populations, every single part of the world, and they're housed in a way that isn't familiar to them. their regular sources of the way of life is taken away. I
Mhm.
mean, it just happens, and it's very, very sad. But
It is, and that it stems from a sort of, I tend to say top down or a prescriptive approach
mm,
that in the case of the redwoods and the Pacific Northwest, that approach is, we can't do this anymore. Stop.
yeah,
Figure it out. Move to a new place if you need to. A lot of people don't have the money to do that. A lot of people don't want to,
mm,
like I think it's very privileged to think that it's fine just to roll up into a new place if your work disappears, and to live away from your family and the place where you grew up. I mean, that I might be comfortable with that, but other people won't. And so, it all kind of bundles up in that way. And what you're left with is this kind of really impossible seeming situation. And in this case, it leads to a very shocking crime, and an environmental crime that is just hard to imagine. But it can be applied all over. It can be kind of, put onto other towns and their own perspectives.
absolutely. And let's talk about the law enforcers, the rangers.
Yeah.
You went out with a couple of rangers.
Yes.
What does their job entail, and how difficult is it to actually
Um,
bring these cases to court?
it's really hard because you not only do you need to find the stump and say, okay, a crime has taken place here. I know that this tree shouldn't have been logged, but you then need to find the wood that matches the stump. And that's really, really, really hard, very rare. So in a span over, I think, 7 years, Redwoods National Park found that there were hundreds of burl poaching cases that had happened over this time. And really, I mean, I profile 2 of them. I think the percentage that are found are just incredibly slim, and that stretches north as well and into other forests where the crime scene is in a really dense, unpopulated area, and then uh, the body or the loot or however you want to put it, by the time you find both of those things, many, many, many weeks have passed, and so it really has to be the right circumstances that lead to it. And so that's what rangers are up against. I think it can feel very overwhelming, and partly I think that that's why when the stars do align, that you might be able to charge someone. It becomes an aggressive case,
Mm.
because here's an opportunity, right? Where perhaps there wasn't one beforehand.
And I'm guessing it's not the best resource department in the world, and not without
No.
its own risks to personal safety. But I
Oh, it's
did,
very dangerous, especially
yeah.
the redwoods is considered the
Mm.
most dangerous national park. So
I did enjoy reading about one ranger who was very, very keen on his job, because it's not just trees that are poached, as we know. There's all sorts of wildlife and special
yeah.
succulents and plants and
Yeah.
salmon. Tell us about the
Yes.
ranger who went
Oh,
to
yeah, Terry
extreme
Gross.
lengths.
Yeah, so Terry Gross, he was a fish and wildlife ranger, which is a little bit different from a Park Service ranger, but that's just kind of semantics, really. He was an investigator, wildlife crime investigator. And actually, it was in the same area that the redwood burl poaching takes place. It was a different era, but totally same region. And so he knew that there were poachers that were illegally catching salmon during their run season, when they are meant to be left alone so that the population can continue. And, I think he was very intrepid and kind of a very unique character. And he decided that the way that he was going to catch and ticket these poachers was not to show up with his headlights blazing on them as they fished, but to mimic a salmon. And so in in the middle of the night, he donned a wetsuit. He was all black. He had his little ticket book in his breast pocket under his under, so it was waterproof. And he lied in this, he lay down in this kind of, what's the term? Like an eddy, maybe,
Yeah.
where the stream was meeting the ocean, where the Pacific, where the salmon were going up, and he let the stream take him where it would be going, or down towards where it would be going. And he witnessed quite a few poachers that were using glow-in-the-dark lures to fish. So they had no lights so that no one would know that they were there, but they were using glow-in-the-dark lures and nets and what have you to catch these salmon. And so he watched a glow-in-the-dark lure go over him. He caught it, attached it to his wetsuit. They reeled him in, and he popped out and ticketed them. So that was the type of, and I have to say that region, I mean, those are the type of people that want to work somewhere that's like, so unique. It's not a city park at all. You're dealing with really kind of wacky and quite serious crimes because, like you're saying, I mean, it's dangerous, right? Like Terry Gross was actually quite brave to do that because who knows, like, it's funny.
I mean, we're laughing because it's a fantastic tale that I want to see on a film. You imagine this guy being the hero of a film, and surprise, I'm not a salmon. But seriously, though, we've talked a lot about the poaching, what the wood looks like, but how on earth is it sold? Because I know that things are highly regulated. What's happening in the US to get the money for these products?
Yep. So it depends on the type of wood. In the burl case, burl is almost always sold to a burl shop, which then will either contact artisans that they know might want to buy just like a slab of burl to either, to craft into what they're going to craft. It gets a bit more complicated as you go north, but also quite interesting. So when it comes to Douglas fir, for instance, or Sitka spruce, all, maple, cedar, all highly poached trees. Douglas fir often ends up as firewood. It can be moved very quickly in this region, just sold by the cord or through the back of a truck. Other wood that might be in high demand for artisanal furnitures and things like that, it requires a sort of underground network. It requires someone who runs a mill that is willing to turn a blind eye, who might be willing to process that wood out of hours, and enter it into the system in that way. But there are also, I don't want to put the blame entirely on mills, because there are also cases where forged paperwork has really allowed wood that was rooted and growing in a conservation area to enter into the market, and the mill owner does not know. And a lot of that is really interesting, right? Because the paperwork might have the coordinates of where this tree came from, or an address, or what have you. And is the mill owner meant to go out there? No. That seems like a really inefficient
of course.
There are some cases of burl poaching where people have listed on the paperwork when they sold it that it came from their family's private property, and then eventually one day when the rangers are suspicious enough, they might go out there and find that there are no trees on that property, or that there is a case of redwood poaching where someone put down their grandfather's address, and it looked very convincing. So, and the challenge is that once it enters the system, how to find it, all of this needs to happen within the span of hours, if not maybe 2 days, right? So it can be very difficult to be on it that quickly. And that's very similar, I think, to the global scale, right? So we can punish global manufacturers for buying wood that might not have very clear sourcing documentation, but in the end, the tree is still been taken down. And so it's really hard it's just really, really difficult to prevent in that way, because eventually it's going to take maybe a bit longer than is required
I was really interested, though, to read about the role of science. The fact
Mhm.
that there is this DNA testing for trees now, the
Yes,
DART,
the
leading
dart
to,
machine.
is it CITES? Is it pronounced
CITES.
CITES?
Yeah, CITES. Yeah.
Tell us
The
about the passion behind the chap in the laboratory and
Yeah,
what
sure.
innovation
Ed.
that is.
Yeah, Ed Espinoza. So just for a very quick overview, CITES is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. And if something is listed in a CITES appendix, it has various levels of legality in terms of how it can be traded. So it might be endangered or at risk of endangerment, depending on where it falls. And, primarily tropical hardwoods are really within these appendices. And that by knowing where something falls, you can then punish accordingly, and
Yeah.
you can manage your kind of imports and exports accordingly as well, right? And this is where organizations like the FSC are really helpful, because you can say, well, it's FSC certified and Forest Stewardship Council certified, and therefore it might be tropical hardwood, but blah blah blah. Okay, so that's where we land. Still, tons and tons of the international wildlife trade is timber. And the challenge with timber, along with all of these other things we've talked about, is that you might be a customs agent and we have this massive globalized economy, and a shipping container comes in and you're a customs agent and it's filled with MDF furniture. And you might think, okay, we've got intel that says that this furniture is made from a teak, a specific species of teak that is CITES listed, therefore it's illegal. And we want to try and prevent this from entering the market and punish the folks that have done this. How are you supposed to tell? It's impossible. And so I think one of the big examples of this was that there's a watch that was it was an influencer watch on Instagram, right? And so it had a lot of back and forth, and eventually it was found to be made from poached wood. So the US Fish and Wildlife Service has developed a forensics lab in Oregon, and that forensics lab looks at all types of environmental crime, but it also has this dedicated timber task force now. And what they've done is they use a mass spectrometry formula, and they use a DART machine that can really specify down to kind of the deepest level what the species of a tree can be. So if that customs agent knows, okay, we suspect that this is poached wood, they can seize a piece of it and send it to the forensics lab. And what they'll do is shave off the tiniest sliver. I was so surprised at how small this is. And they can feed it into this DART machine that essentially is at a very high temperature and will heat the wood, and the oils will evaporate or become kind of condensation. And they are absorbed by the DART machine that pumps out a sort of DNA profile. And ideally, and what the lab is working towards now, is to have standard profiles of each tree on the CITES appendices, so that they can then compare the seized wood to the database of appendices listed endangered species, and they can say, okay, we know that this is an ivory tree that shouldn't be, or sorry, ebony tree that is illegal to trade, and we're going to seize all of it. So it is quite exciting in that way. You
Very
still need a
good.
lot of intelligence, I think, to get to the point, but it's the identification process is really important. And so.
And also, we haven't got time in this interview, but you talk about your visit to South America as well.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
so what is the solution to such a massive problem? We can see that it's really difficult to prosecute. The science is helping with proof that it might be illegal timber. We can see there is a huge social and economic problem when we take away a means of living. But I understand that you live within a community forest. Perhaps you could explain what that is and
Yeah.
how that works.
Yeah, so I have a community forest just outside my window here, and I don't know, poaching still happens from community forests. I just want to put that out there.
Yeah.
But there are some management structures within them that can respond differently to that poaching. And so a community forest is essentially, where I live, it was once managed by the province. So it was similar to Forest Service land, or, we would call it Crown land here because it was owned by the government. And a community organization has bought it and is now managing it through a board structure for community use, as opposed to only profit or only conservation or only tourism. It actually brings it all in together. And there are some examples of this across the province as well, and around the world. And the benefit of that is that the decisions are made by people that live where the forest is. Sometimes people still massively disagree, but there's kind of a different feeling when you're disagreeing with your neighbor, as opposed to a congressperson or a politician. And in some interesting cases where poaching has taken place from community forest land, they were able to do kind of different problem-solving activities. So there's a community forest just to the west of me that was seeing poaching, and they suspected that they knew who the poachers were. They actually ended up offering them the opportunity to come and legally cut the firewood and take the firewood and or what have you, and give it to provide to their family if they needed it. And that was a kind of very quick problem. Like, I don't know if it stopped entirely, but it was a very kind of community oriented solution that they could try, that, certainly a federal national park or a government, national government run national park can't whip into action that quickly. And they might not want to be seen as doing that either, and so they have some unique kind of problem solving measures around them. But to go back to Rory Young, who we spoke about at the very beginning of the podcast, Rory Young was involved in all sorts of anti-poaching measures, and his conclusion was that until you solve inequality, that poaching is not going to go anywhere. And that is a huge problem, and that is a huge undertaking. But I also agree. It's a socio-economic issue.
It is a socio-economic issue. I understand there's some really good models in Mexico of community forests that you write about in the book. And maybe that is also, these community forests might be a blueprint whereby people have input and some agency over what happens, but also some use of the forest in a way that's sustainable.
Mm-hmm. And you were mentioning too, a little bit earlier, but often community forests are run by local indigenous communities, and that's a really important aspect as well. And even to the poachers who I spoke to, who in North America we would use the term settler, or they're non-indigenous. Even the poachers were saying, this is actually indigenous land. This is not. This is, in the end, we're, they say that we're taking from the federal government, but the federal government took it from someone else. And I thought, the poachers are saying this, they understand that inequality and that challenge. It's probably time that our management structures and our governments start thinking about it as well.
It's really good. And actually, you put a quotation in the book in the afterwards saying, separating nature from human use has never kept it safe.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think sums up beautifully. And what have you changed your point of view, having carried out all these in-depth research and got to know some folks? Have you changed your perspective on nature conservation?
Oh yeah, big time. I think when I first started reporting it, I thought, well, this will be a straightforward story about good-hearted rangers solving a crime that is horrible. And now I'm not so sure that national park structures are even the right. I don't know the right way. I don't want to pretend that I do, but I definitely look at conservation areas very differently now, in North America and even in the UK. Like I think there are ways that we should be thinking about how we work, how we are part of the environment as opposed to separate from it. That's when we're talking about conservation being a colonial construct in a way. I think that that's really part of that. Seeing yourself as different and above, or maybe not above, but separate. I think that these are all really, we've seen how misguiding that can be, and how it trickles down and hurts the vulnerable.
Wow, we've gone 360 on this. We've looked at the start of everything, what's happening. Do you think the punishment fits a crime of poaching?
I think a lot of investigators would argue no, that the incentive is still very strong, because the chances of getting caught are low. And even if you do get caught, I mean, often the fines are in the hundreds or in the low thousands, which can seem really quite low for endangering an old growth tree, but actually it's really interesting. In Oregon, there are some scholars, and there are some organizations that are working on a sort of restorative justice approach to poaching, because it happens so commonly around this part of the world. And part of that is requiring the poacher to work with the park to do restoration around the poaching site. And I'm very keenly watching to see how this will turn out. I think that some of the poachers that I have come to know would actually be really good park employees. And due to past run-ins and frustrations, they're not going to apply to work at the park. But people enter into professions in all sorts of ways. And when I heard about this opportunity that a turtle poacher received, actually someone had been poaching turtles, and when they were caught, they were ordered to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to do restoration on the poaching area and all of this. I'm really keen to know what the outcome of that is, and including people in the management.
That's really interesting. And finally, Lyndsie, what's your dream scenario?
Yeah, I think I would love for that restorative justice process to work. Actually, I think that would be, I think I would feel really motivated by that. And I think the poachers would as well. And on a town level, I think that, or on the local level anyway, stronger efforts to hire locally and to not transfer people so often within organizations that they might be working in redwoods for 2 years and then leave. I think that can lead to some pretty rough relationship building on the local front with humans, as opposed to just managing the land.
Well, thank you so much. What an absolute privilege it's been to speak to you today. And I so admire your thorough research and sensitivity and its deep probing into a really nuanced problem. I really recommend that listeners buy a copy of Tree Thieves, Crime and Survival in the Woods. So thank you, Lyndsie.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.